Why the West has failed Ukraine. A disclaimer, as per the following bullet points: I'm not a Ukrainian national. I am not of Ukrainian descent. I'm an ordinary Canadian. I do not work for the Canadian government, the Ukrainian government, or any national intelligence agency, any military agency or paramilitary entity. The views I express are based upon the facts as we know them and assessment by numerous professional experts in the fields of diplomacy, military history, and geopolitics. Ukraine has a duly elected democratic government and is defending itself from an aggressor state bent on destroying their sovereign right to exist. Ukraine has not deported children to concentration camps. Ukraine has not bombed hospitals, schools, museums, civilians, and civilian infrastructure. Ukraine has not butchered children, the elderly, or any other civilians. In the most recent Ukrainian presidential election, only 2% of the population voted for a far-right nationalist-type party, which is far below many other European countries and far below the near 50% of U.S. voters to cast their ballots for a fascist party. Quote, "The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays, is coming to its close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences." Winston Churchill. For those old enough and or historically literate enough, the world has reached yet another critical juncture, reminiscent of 1938 when Chamberlain tried to appease Nazi Germany. Why has this happened again? Perhaps an irrational fear of the Russian Federation's rhetoric regarding the use of nuclear weapons. Isolationist movements, especially in the United States. Pro-Russian interference in elections and migrant policies, such as that in Moldova, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Poland, Finland. The West has once again underestimated the resolve and the brutality of the enemy. Vis-a-vis Ukraine, the key genres of failure include military failures and political failures. Most military failures are precipitated by and provoked by political failures. Political incompetency can be national, regional, or global in nature. Some genres of failure, such as those attributed directly to human nature, are harder to define. In this presentation, the answers to the title question are not listed in any particular order of importance. However, readers are invited to use their imagination if a rank is desired. Each response has played a role, some more so than others, some obvious, some less so. Political. The failure to respond aggressively in 2014 when RF annexed Crimea and started the uprising in Donetsk. A failure to insist on a mechanism to enforce the Minsk agreements. A failure to recognize the wider aims of the RF, such as empire building and spheres of influence, such as those in Georgia, Moldova, the Baltics, Serbia, etc. These missteps empowered the RF to build upon a false narrative, launch a colossal propaganda campaign, and invade Ukraine fully in 2022. The Global South. Egypt, Pakistan, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, etc. have betrayed Ukraine. These countries depend upon Ukraine for most of their grain and oil seeds, and yet refused or were coerced to refuse to stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty. RF propaganda is amongst the world's best and has been allowed to permeate Africa, South America, India, and elsewhere. This narrative has corrupted the Global South, and the expansion of the BRICS alliance is a harbinger of a far wider, looming global conflict. When political leaders or media suggest that Ukraine should negotiate, have they asked themselves if they would do that if their sovereign territory was invaded, annexed, and brutalized? December 12, 2023, President Zelensky's answer to this was, "Would you surrender your children to terrorists?" Holding Ukraine hostage to internal political issues is morally bankrupt. Examples include Hungary versus the European Union, Republicans versus Democrats, and recently the extortion for mineral rights. This is a dereliction of duty on so many levels, including but not limited to not upholding key tenets of the United Nations Charter and commitments to an ally. Military. Slow and piecemeal provision of weapons. The war would have been over in 2023 if sufficient weapons had been provided quickly and en masse to defend infrastructure, the ports of Odessa, the front lines, and to make the occupation of Crimea untenable. This has cost hundreds of thousands of lives and will cost more in the long term. Promises of weapons do not win a war. Deliveries do. Promising 1 million shells, but delivering 300,000. Promising an air defense system, and 12 months later, it's still not delivered. Stating support, quote, for as long as it takes, end quote, is not the same thing as stating, quote, support to win, end quote. Bureaucracy and political correctness prolongs the conflict unnecessarily. Knowingly countenance Ukraine to launch a counteroffensive with its hands tied behind its back on behalf of NATO in 2023. NATO would never put its military in this position without adequate weapons, air cover, and engineers. This was disingenuous and disrespectful of Ukraine. Despite this, and after spending less than 6% of the U.S. military budget, Ukraine has inflicted massive losses in materiel and soldiers against NATO's biggest enemy, with not one NATO soldier on the ground or at sea. RF has had more casualties than it did in the 9-year Soviet-Afghan War. The West has snared itself right into the RF playbook. The RF believes it can outlast a Western-backed Ukrainian military by sacrificing thousands of prisoners, mobilized conscripts, and ethnic minorities, and most recently, North Korean soldiers. Their economy is already on a war footing, and there is little to no bureaucracy. There is little to no opposition in the RF. The disunited nations. Violations of the UN Charter should mean expulsion from the Security Council. RF veto power means nothing gets done. Humanitarian corridors could not even be enforced to save the people of Mariupol. No power to protect a nuclear power plant from becoming a military base. The UN is so risk-averse that they provide little to no direct aid in Ukraine's most desperate regions. Failure in Ukraine has global implications. As outlined in earlier presentations about the need to support Ukraine, there are a plethora of highly valid reasons why the West should have done better. These consequences are obvious to some, but ostensibly lost on most or willfully ignored. The The risk of wider war, rising food and fuel prices, unpunished war crimes, environmental damage, massive loss of life, the collapse of the rules-based order, refugee crises, and trillions for reconstruction, etc., etc. RF, China, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Mali, Niger, Myanmar, and many other bad actors are sitting back and laughing at the West's ineptitude, incompetence, betrayal, and its vulnerabilities. It is a clear signal that now is the time to attack their neighbors and or their perceived enemies militarily or via cyber attacks. The sheer volume of human and material resources being wasted on war diverts these resources away from the crisis hurtling towards us from our shared ecosystem and the threat to all the species we share this planet with. References. Ukraine will never stop fighting, and there still is time. Victory to Ukraine. If you wish to help, please visit the following links. Stand with Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.